I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Ashley Nellis. Ashley is one of the nation's leading experts on life sentences and is co-author of the book, The Meaning of Life, The Case for Abolishing Life Sentences. Ashley has published influential and groundbreaking reports about the use of life without parole, life with parole, and virtual life sentences. Her newest report, A Matter of Life, The Scope and Impact of Life and Long-Term Imprisonment in the United States, was released in January 2024. Ashley is a member of the faculty at American University in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology. She also was the former co-director of research at the Sentencing Project. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And Ashley, just before we get started, I want to just give you a big shout out. I have known Ashley's work for as long as I've been an academic, and it has always been so incisive and helpful in my own research. And I'm so excited to have you on the show to talk about this latest report. And before we even get into this report about life sentences in America, could you just share with our listeners sort of how you got here, why you became interested in life sentences?
Sure. It was somewhat by happenstance. I joined the Sentencing Project where I worked for 16 years in 2008 and toward the end of 2008. And shortly after I started there, my then boss, Mark Maurer, asked if I would simply revise the lifer numbers that he had collected and reported on in 2003 and 4. And it was not any more significant, really, than him handing me a manila folder of his numbers from 4 years earlier. But shortly after that, the Supreme Court took up Graham v. Florida, which was the first case, a series of Supreme Court cases related to juveniles receiving life without parole. And in the Graham case, that pertained to juveniles who had been convicted of non-homicide crimes that did not include a homicide. And so I was able to join that research right away by providing the preliminary figures of juveniles serving life without parole for crimes of non-homicide, which supported the petitioner's claim that it was both cruel and unusual and was part of a favorable ruling.
So, there you go. You've been at this since really the forefront of where we started looking at the idea of second chances for people who were sentenced to life, particularly for juveniles. And here we are all these years later, we're still talking about the same subject, and there's been a lot of change on the ground. And so let's just get into this fabulous report, A Matter of Life, The Scope and Impact of Life and Long-Term Imprisonment in the United States. It's a comprehensive survey. It analyzes sort of what we mean when we say the word life, who's serving life, how many people, where, for what. And so before we get into the actual numbers, when you talk about life, what do you mean? What to you in this report is a life sentence, and how do you break those out?
So for the purposes of my research and as far back as when it started, life sentences include life with the possibility of parole and also life without the possibility of parole, which are two statutory titles for a sentence that someone could get. Generally, a person can get anywhere from a year to hundreds of years in prison, or they can get life with parole or life without parole or some combination of those. So in some ways, it can be easier to collect information on life with and life without because those are by statute. There's a third category, which is virtual life, which I started collecting data on several years ago. And that is what we define as a sentence that you are not likely to outlive by the very nature of the term of years. So that when you kind of consider the average age of a person coming to prison and the average lifespan of a person that is incarcerated is about 50 years. Most people cannot live longer than 50 years in prison. And so that's a fairly conservative estimate. Even the federal government defines it as 40 years. But just to be sort of on the conservative side, we put it at 50 years. So any sentence that's 50 years or longer, we also include as life, and we separate those out in the report and in all of my research so that people can see the breakdown of life with, life without, and virtual life in prison.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about life, and unless you specify, you mean all of those, life with parole, without parole, and also these virtual life sentences. So how many people are in our prison system, first of all? Like, what's the big number?
The big number these days is 1.2 million. That's a decline since about 2009, 2010, and with a fairly sharp decline during the pandemic. So it's about 1.2 million in all of the state and federal prisons.
Does that include the jail population?
So jails are different. Jails brings it up to over 2 million or just about 2 million. Jails are sort of different. Those are typically people who either they've been sentenced to less than a year or they have not yet been convicted.
So most people who are in jail aren't serving a life sentence, which is why we're not really going to talk about them. But I just wanted to flag for the listeners that when we talk about 1.2 million, we're talking about folks who are serving time for felony convictions in general. And so out of that 1.2, how many of those people are serving a life sentence?
It's about 16%, or about 1 in 6 people in prison today is serving a life sentence.
1 in 6. Wow. I mean, think about that for a minute. 1 in 6 people is facing a possible death in prison?
Right. So the way that I think about it is that when a judge is sentencing that person, either mandatorily or discretionally, they are saying to themselves that it is justifiable that this person dies in prison because of whatever they've been convicted of. It may not happen. In the case of life without parole, which is 56,000 of that group, it will happen. With the others, it may or it may not, but it could.
Because life without parole means person has no opportunity for release. And in theory, somebody who's serving a life with parole sentence could be released on parole after serving a certain number of years. And virtual life sentences, it obviously just depends on how many years the person has been sentenced to before they possibly become eligible for parole and whether that hits in the span of their lifetime. That's wild. 1 in 6 and 56,000 people for sure, unless something happens with the change in the law, are going to die in prison. That's tremendous. That's a lot. And how does that compare to prior years in terms of the lifer population?
It's a mixed story. So in terms of life without the possibility of parole, which is the harshest of the 3 sentences, this is the all-time highest number that the US has ever had. So it has crept upward slowly over the last 4 years. But if you go back to 2003, when we first collected this information, and we look at that number compared to today, it's a 68% increase. And if you look at the change between 2009 and today, 2009 is important because that's when the prison population started to decline. You can see that the prison population declines and the lifer population continues to increase by about 30% over that last number of years. So what it's saying is that at one hand, we are making some inroads. We're making some modifications. We're making some progress on the prison population. It is starting to come down way too slowly, but it is coming down. And it could be coming down much more quickly. And at this rate could take decades in order to reach any sort of pre-mass incarceration level. But at the same time that we are making those small changes that allow smaller prison populations, life sentences, particularly life without the possibility of parole, are continuing to increase, which to me says that we are not making enough of a change to people convicted of violent crimes, because most of the people serving life sentences are there for a violent offense. And in fact, half of our prisons in most places are comprised of people who have been convicted of violent crimes. So we're not going to end mass incarceration unless we take a real robust effort at reducing sentences for people who have been convicted of violence.
Sorry, I'm sort of gobsmacked right now. 68% increase in the use of life without parole in the last 20 years. Is that what you said? In the last 22 years? What explains that? That's really significant. Even as we're seeing the prison population drop, the number of people serving life without parole has gone up by that significant of a percentage. What's happening?
Well, it's a few different things. Some of it is these mandatory penalties that, by definition, can't take account of various factors that would have in the past been mitigating. So things like age or the role a person played in a particular crime, whether it was a small role, but in a big crime. In the way it is in many states now, there's a law of parties. Everybody who's at the felony goes down for the harshest crime that occurred, a murder that occurred maybe while a robbery was happening. But not everybody committed the murder. Only one person committed the murder. That's often called felony murder. So laws that require or allow a life sentence for a broader range of crimes are a big part of that. Laws that allow people who have been victims of crimes and are responding to that victimization through committing a homicide. In the case of women, often women, but victims of domestic violence who commit homicide to escape their abuser. That is not something that used to be treated as harshly as it is today. And also just the expansion of the kinds of crimes that can be accompanied by life sentences. So it may not be mandatory that you get life without parole for an armed robbery, but you could get life without parole for an armed robbery. Whereas in the past, that would not have happened.
Right. I mean, that's what's so interesting. I don't know if people realize that there are people sentenced to life without parole, sentenced to die in prison in non-homicidal offenses. I mean, that's a really difficult idea.
Yeah. So if you think about Terrence Graham, where all of this current movement started, he was convicted of a non-homicide and he was 16 at the time. It was in Florida. His first offense was a robbery and he was given a probation. But his life sentence was held as sort of, if you don't obey the rules of probation, I could give you a life sentence. And, if you violate the terms of your probation. And he did. He violated the terms of his probation by committing an armed burglary. So that was a crime, obviously, and also it violated his probation. He got the life sentence for violating the probation because that was what had been held out. So you could get a life sentence basically for a technical violation. And even as a juvenile, at least you could then. Obviously, the Supreme Court ruled against that, and that can't happen, but that's just for juveniles. Courts are extremely punitive, and that is a large part to do with that tough on crime era of the 80s that got even more tough in the 90s. And the lifers have not benefited at all from the reforms.
Let's unpack that a little bit more because your report, again, documents some pretty interesting things. So we have like 56,000 people serving life without parole, and that is an increase. But we also see a slight decrease in the use of life without parole in some states, but an increase in other states, right? Can you talk about that a little bit? I don't want to get too wonky here, but I am curious.
Sure. It's hard to talk about it without getting too in the weeds, but there have been reforms on life without parole, and the vast majority of these reforms have benefited juveniles because of the Supreme Court rulings, Graham, Miller, and Montgomery. And in Miller, the Supreme Court said you cannot give life without parole to a juvenile under the age of 18 in a state that applies it mandatorily, doesn't allow the judge to consider some of the mitigating factors like age. So that's 29 states and the federal government right there. So those states had to reform their laws. And many states, thanks to organizations led by the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth, have significantly revised and reformed their laws around juveniles serving life without parole. A lot of the declines that we're seeing in life without parole in the 2024 year are those juveniles that are now no longer serving life without parole. So it's not that much of a win for the whole movement as it is those juveniles now longer being. So many of them have been released. Over 1,000 of the people who were juveniles at the time have been released, and many more are under consideration for release. But some have been commuted to life with parole. So that's why I say it's a mixed bag. A lot of it is a benefit to the juveniles, but some of it now they have life with parole. And depending on what state they live in, they may not get parole.
One of the things we've talked about here on Just Justice before is just that there's this parole idea. If you behave and if you follow the rules and you do everything right, you'll get released on parole. And then there's this reality that parole boards are just so reluctant to release people. And so you've got folks who could easily manage to function well in society that are being held in prison just because there's no mechanism other than the parole board to get them out. Now, tell me about the impact of some of these sentences. So who sort of is impacted most by life sentences? And do we see racial disparities? Do we see age disparities? Do we see class disparities? What do you know about who is getting hit with these life sentences?
Well, in this survey and in ones I've done in the past, I ask some questions around that. I ask about the number of women serving life and the number of men, the racial dynamics, the crime of conviction, and also how many are currently, at the time of the survey, 55 and older, which is a pretty widely used standard for elderly status if you're in prison, because people in prison tend to age more quickly and they come in with many more physical problems than the general population. So 55 is a pretty broadly agreed upon age for elderly status. So we find that about 40% of the people serving life are elderly. They're currently elderly. So that on its own is a troubling statistic, because we know that people who are older are much less likely to commit crime. One of the most reliable facts about the likelihood of committing crime is age. It's actually more reliable than anything else. Is how old are you? Because most people who commit crime or who are likely to commit crime are going to do it during their adolescence and their emerging adulthood. After the age of 25 or so, it drops precipitously. And once you get to your 30s, maybe your late 30s, if you're a so-called chronic offender, it's almost nothing if you were an offender earlier on in your life, because it's a young man's game. People have different ways of explaining it, but it really correlates highly with age. So if you have somebody in prison in their 50s and 60s and 70s, and you're saying that it's because they're just not safe to release, it's a lie. They are safe to release. In fact, they'd probably do more good to society on the outside because they'd be contributing to society instead of taking from it. They could be, and often are, very eager to become credible messengers to young people, and they want to be with their family in their final stretch. So the fact that 40% of the lifer population is elderly is shameful to me. Other countries don't do this. There's also the fact that people who commit violence, homicide, let's say, often come from communities and families where violence is a regular part of the day. And that is a traumatic experience. That is a serious trauma that people who are living in violence are experiencing day after day, that the rest of society is not experiencing. It doesn't excuse it, but we have to have solutions that are better than throwing people away for the rest of their lives. We're a wise country. We're a powerful country. There has to be something better we can do about communities that are completely under-resourced and filled with troubling poverty and neglect and have gun violence on a regular basis. We have solutions to that. Criminologists have solutions to that. It's just that policymakers, they don't want to use them. They'd rather throw people in prison because it looks tough on crime. So that's why we see these sort of intergenerational crime patterns that we see. It's not based on the individual. It's based on the choices we're making as a country.
It's so important to note that so many people who engage in violent behavior in the criminal legal system themselves were once victims of violence or were witness to violence. And there was no one there to intervene and provide assistance for that initial exposure to violence. And yet we hold people accountable in really punitive ways when they react in violent ways. And that's a very complex subject because harm is devastating and can be devastating. And yet there is an absence of responsibility that our structures are willing to take on. So what percentage of people who are serving a life sentence, whether it's life without parole, life with parole, or virtual life sentence, what percentage are people of color? Can you break that out for us?
Sure. So just about half, 45%, are African American. And then a third or so are white, and 16% are Latino. That's likely to be an undercount. Some states are still not reporting ethnicity. So it's about 2/3 are people of color, at least.
Wow. So 1 in 6 people in prison are serving a life sentence, and 2/3 of those people are people of color. That is astounding and troubling, deeply troubling, and has real policy implications. Your report also makes a really interesting finding about women. Women are not as represented in the criminal legal system overall, but of the women who are in prison, how many of those women are serving a life sentence?
For the women, it's about 1 in 11. So women make up about 3% of the total lifer population nationally. And it amounts to about 1 of every 11 of the women who is in prison is serving life.
Some states, it's not 1 in 11. It's even worse, right? Like in Vermont and New Hampshire, like 1 in 6 women are serving a life sentence, right? If you had to hypothesize what's going on in terms of why women are incarcerated and punished so severely.
Women, for whatever reason, they don't commit homicide nearly as frequently as men. When they do commit homicide, particularly if it involves their husband or a child, there's historically not been any sort of really deep investigation as to how that could be, other than to just assume they must be truly evil women. Now, there is a growing curiosity and growing understanding about the role that PTSD plays in having a child, the role that postpartum depression can play in those early months after having a child, and the role that PTSD plays in domestic violence, and that it doesn't have to be something that is a crime that is directly following a domestic violence incident, but that the long-term experience of physical, emotional, sexual violence against somebody, and it's usually women in the partnership, plays in terms of them feeling they have no other solution than this. So we always want to be careful when we look at statistics from these small states like New Hampshire and Vermont. But, in those states, if they give a woman life without parole or the death penalty or whatever, it's usually one of those two scenarios.
Yeah. And, I did a whole bunch of research on women in the context of innocence in no crime cases, in particular, where women were convicted of crimes that never actually happened. And to your first point about women and gender expectations, there's so many biases that come into the processing and treatment of women in the legal system that can lead to outcomes that are far more severe than one might otherwise expect. So, yeah, it's a really interesting thing that you found in looking at life sentences among women. And so you also make the argument in this report, as we're looking at this life sentences, as we're looking at a slight decline in life with parole sentences, but also this sort of uptick in people serving life without parole, you make the argument that we don't need life sentences at all because they don't accomplish much in terms of public safety, which I think is one of the arguments that people put forward about why we need life sentences. So, what are you finding? Like, what about recidivism? I know you talked about the age crime curve, that people sort of just naturally age out of crime. They're like, I'm too darn old to be doing this. But what else are you finding? What does the recidivism data show to the idea of people reoffending once they've been released? What are we seeing?
For lifers who get out, and that, many of them don't, so it's small samples. But when we see people coming out of prison after a life with parole sentence, or even if they've been commuted by the governor in a life without parole sentence, or have benefited from some of the law changes post Miller and Montgomery, the recidivism rates are pretty low. I mean, they're less than 5%. They're surprising even to people who study recidivism. And some of it is that they've been in prison for a very long time. And so they're now much older and wiser. I think it goes beyond that, though, because we don't want to suggest that long-term imprisonment leads to low recidivism. I think we can achieve these same results of extremely low recidivism with much shorter periods of time in prison. And we know this because other countries do it. If you look at in the UK and Norway and in other countries, they are able to see the same sort of low recidivism rates among people after you release them after 10 or 15, 20 years at the most. So we continue to incarcerate people maybe 20, 30 years beyond their point of dangerousness. It's really just a waste of resources, and it's also a waste of a human life.
You've mentioned sort of this global comparison a number of times. Like your study found, we have almost 200,000 people serving some form of a life sentence. How does that situate the United States relative to the rest of the world?
I mean, the vast majority of people serving life are here in the US. When you look at the most extreme of those three, life without parole, more than 8 in 10 are here in the US. So many other countries, they have life and they have different variations of life. But when they say life, what it equates to is about 10 years. So here in the US, I mean, we would never, well, not never, but in this current modern era of criminal justice policy, many people would laugh at the idea that a life sentence would be 10 years. But even in the US, this used to be the way. In hardcore states like Louisiana and Pennsylvania, which now lead the country and the world in the use of life imprisonment, a life sentence was 10 to 15 years. And a lot of that is because there was an active use of clemency. It was not considered this Hail Mary at the end. It was a regular and expected part of the criminal legal system. You're given life, but the carrot is still very much used. And so, yes, you have this stick, but we will definitely be coming back in 10 years and granting clemency if you behave yourself. Now, I mean, nobody would say that now. And, that's unfortunate because, like everybody, people respond better to positive than they do to negative.
Sure. And just to stay with this international perspective, I mean, we have, you said about 80% of the world's population serving life without parole. Like, think about that. The United States represents what, like 4% of the world population, but we have 83% of all people serving life without parole. That makes us really unusual in the context of punishing. And that's not a comparison limited just to sort of the most extremely punitive nations like North Korea or something like that. I mean, this includes our partners. Our partners in Europe don't use life sentences anywhere near really at all compared to the way that we use them. That's, again, these numbers are just crazy when you really start to unpack them. What are we doing here? Why are we so exceptional in how punitive we are? And, you talked about age mattering, this age crime curve. And you talked about the elderly and how really we're over incarcerating, right? People can be released basically anytime after they're like 30 and change, depending on who they are and where they came from and what their histories are, because people just sort of age out of crime. And you also, at the same time in this report, take a look at a new category, or new in terms of the research done by the Sentencing Project, looking at emerging adults. And so, can you tell us why that category of people matters? Who's serving time, lifetimes under this emerging adult concept, and what it means?
So I'll answer what matters first. And that is that going back to these juvenile rulings, which have really been leading the way in terms of starting to scale back life sentences, is to first do that for the youngest. A lot of the reasoning behind the favorable rulings was the neuroscience that clearly and unambiguously shows that people under the age of 18 are working with a stage of development that really does not allow them to have full access to the tools they'll have as a fully grown adult. Cognitive tools, emotional tools, physical tools. They're not fully grown human beings yet. They're in a period of life where they're more risk prone, where they literally have less remorse because of the brain development and that prefrontal cortex. They don't have the impulse control, and they're susceptible to the impressions of their peers, particularly their negative peers. And they tend to act more reactively in emotionally charged situations. So anyone who knows a teenager knows that. It turns out that the neuroscience that finds all of this extends up to the mid 20s. And there's convincing research out there with brain imaging and all manner of testing that shows that all of the things that we have agreed on as far as juveniles and their lack of culpability up to the age of 18 is actually true up until their mid 20s. So there is some agreement in the states now that there should be some sort of reduced culpability for people age 18 and above, up to maybe age 24. So because I have benefited from working in the research world as well as in the advocacy world, I felt like this year would be a good year for me to start to try to take a first look at how many are there, similar to what I did with the juveniles in 2008 and all lifers over the years. Is we've taken care of a lot of the juvenile issues, and that has been monitored by other organizations, but nobody yet has collected data on the people under the age of 25 who are serving life without and virtual life. So this is the first time that there's a national profile of this population, which is a critical step toward seeing exactly where is the problem the biggest, where are the people serving the largest proportion of the sentences. And so that's what this report adds to the existing reports in terms of new data.
So, what did you find? This population, it's 25 and under, so it's 24 and 364 days. Is that what you're measuring?
It's under the age of 25, so 24 and under.
But you could be 24 in 6 months and still.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, it could be 24 in 7 months.
Right. And we're talking about that. We're talking about the age the person is at the time they commit the offense, right? So what did you find?
So what we found is that there's about 70,000, it's actually 68,000 of the roughly 200,000 people were under the age of 25 at the time of their crime, including 36,000 who are serving life without parole. So that's about a third of the emerging adults, and 20,000 who have life with parole, and then another 12,000 who have virtual life sentences. So that's a lot of numbers. Basically, just over a third of the life sentence population was not yet fully adult when they were sent away for potentially the rest of their life.
Just to be really technical for 1 second, the data in your report doesn't disaggregate between juveniles 18 and under and then emerging adults 18 to 25. So it's really just looking at that under 25 population encompassing juveniles.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, Ashley, you make some pretty bold recommendations at the end of this report, and I want to unpack a little bit of them. So, just to continue on this conversation about emerging adults, one of your recommendations is that we expand or eliminate the distinctions between juveniles and emerging adults. And so you call for the abolition of life without parole for people under 25 years of age. Is that right? Did I get that right?
That's right. Except I call for the abolition of parole. The abolition of LWAP for everybody.
And then for people under the age of 20, we're going to go right back to that. But for people under the age of 25, what do you recommend?
One of the recommendations is that we cap prison sentences at 20 years. And then for people under the age of 25, I recommend that we cap prison sentences at 15 years and that there be this mandatory review that happens pretty early on in one sentence and within 5 to 10 years.
So you just called for a cap of all sentences to 20 years. So that obviously eliminates life without parole. It eliminates life sentences. So you're sort of saying that no one should be sentenced, no matter what the crime, for more than 20 years. Now, anyone in America who isn't sort of in the field might be really stunned by that recommendation. Can you explain how you get to a 20-year cap?
It sounds like a radical recommendation in the United States, but it's fairly standard internationally. Even in Norway, where there was this mass murderer who committed, a crime in a school, killed 21 school children, dozens, he received a 20-year sentence. Does that mean that at 20 years, just whether you like it or not, he's coming out? No, he could be civilly committed. In the US, I don't know that we would adopt civil commitment like other countries have. We would not, and I would not recommend that you release somebody who is not ready to be released. I would just recommend that you really change the standard. So most of the ways that we decide on whether somebody is ready for release is to look back at the crime that they committed. And that just is dead in the water for most people who are serving life, because most people who are serving life have committed either a murder or some sort of sexual offense. So that is a difficult thing to get around if you're only going to be looking at the crime that they committed. Another way of doing this would be to look at how the person has changed over time. And I think if we did that, and we really did that, authentically, we would see that most of these folks are ready to come out after 20 years, the vast majority.
Remember, we were talking about why we punish. And one of the reasons was public safety, right? To deter people from future crimes. And we kind of went into why these life sentences are kind of overkill because of that age crime curve. But there's another argument, right, that says victims and crime survivors require life sentences for retributive purposes. And I'm wondering what you would say to people who make that argument, that there's some kind of just desserts. If you commit a homicide, you don't deserve to get out after 20 years.
I think that victims, and this is going to sound somewhat harsh, but it is my view, they've been sold this argument by prosecutors mostly, that you're going to feel a lot better if this person goes away for life, and that you're going to find the peace that you need, the forgiveness you need, and all that if this person goes to prison for life. So just stick with me through this trial and just become the best victim rights person you can be. And then at the end, you'll feel better. But the research doesn't suggest that. Victims are not, they're not a monolith. There's a broad range of people and feelings that people have as a result of losing a loved one to homicide, let's say, or to a violent crime. First of all, not all of them want a life sentence. So to say, oh, this is what the victims want is not completely honest, because not all victims want that. But even of the ones who do want that, they don't get it. They don't find that forgiveness and that peace and everything through the other person's suffering. It's not really the place of the prison system to bring that. And it was never designed to be that. It's called the corrections and the reformatory and all of those words that define our correction system because it's supposed to correct the person who committed it. It's not a system that's supposed to correct the victim. And it doesn't do anyone any justice, especially the victim, to the victim's family in this case, to suggest that, oh, we're just doing this for you. We're doing this so that you'll feel better, because you're not. You're doing this, if you're a prosecutor, so that you can win the case and get the toughest sentence.
That's an interesting perspective to take, right? And so 20 years, you think, is adequate to allow somebody to age out of crime, to get to that point past where they would commit offenses, where it's enough punishment and just desert, so to speak, and that maybe there's a different or better way to support folks who have survived violence or who've lost a loved one to violence without putting someone away for life. And these are all really interesting points that you make in this very compelling report that is the newest census, if you will, on who is serving life. And with that, Ashley, I'm going to thank you so much for coming on the show. I so appreciate it. I appreciate your work and your efforts in this area. And thank you for being on the show.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Just Justice. If you like what you heard, please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. To share an idea for the show or to stay in touch, head to jessicahenryjustice.com or find me on the socials at Jessica Henry Justice. See you next time.